Okay, and welcome everyone. This is like a physical meeting where everyone just needs to get into the room and find the seats and pour coffee in there. So we still have these sounds of running meeting, but a warm welcome to all of you. My name is Mette Müller, and I am one of two vice chairs of IDDC. And together with the chair of IDDC, Dominic Haslam, I'll be moderating this first session. Details, we are recording this session to be able to share on YouTube afterwards. So now you know. Kindly make sure that you have your right name shown on your picture, together with the abbreviation of your organization. And then I would like to invite you to write in the chat where you are joining today's workshop from, which city are you in, and if possible also, how is the weather, just so we get a sense of where people are joining in from. Kindly have your microphone muted unless you are asking a question, and then you can raise your hand if you click on participants, and then you can raise your hand and we can see who has questions. But while the last people are coming into the room, I'd like to give the word to the chair of IDDC, Dominic Haslam.
Thank you very much, Mette. I hope you can all hear me well. Thank you to everybody who's joining as we go. It's great to see so many. Building back inclusively, obviously from the pandemic, and in some ways it feels odd. I know some of you are joining from parts of the world where we're still very much in the middle of serious waves of the pandemic. But I also think it's important that we start that conversation now, so that we're looking at how we build back out of the pandemic as early as possible. I think one of the ways that I've heard the pandemic described by Vladimir Chuk from IDA is as really shining a light on just how far we have yet to go. So for those of us working with the disability movement and from the disability movement, I think it's always been clear that there's a long way to go, but COVID has really shone a light on that. I think it's been very easy at times to celebrate the advances we've made around the CRPD, around the Global Disability Summit, around the Sustainable Development Goals being far more inclusive than their predecessors. But COVID has really taught us the lesson again, if we needed to learn it again, and taught the rest of the world that really we have so far to go still in terms of the situations that many of people are living in and the barriers that they face. And it's one of the reasons why we've very specifically talked about this series of webinars we have this week as building back inclusively. Building off the phrase that many people are using about building back better. It reminds me a little bit of the phrase that came out from the Sustainable Development Goals of talking about leaving no one behind. And people have very different definitions of who the no one is that they don't want to leave behind. And I think the issue for us in the disability community is making sure that when we talk about building back better, that includes the inclusion of persons with disabilities, because if we don't push for it, there is every opportunity for the world to claim it's built back better and yet still leaving people with disabilities behind. So I'm really pleased that we're launching the sessions this week with this session kind of looking generally at experience of living with the pandemic and in some places recovery, but in many places still very much living through the center of it. And it's the first in a series of workshops we have this week. So also today we have one on COVID recovery and disability rights. Tomorrow we have two, one around climate change and disability, and one around access to digital learning education, subtitled Technology, the Pitfalls and Opportunities. So I think we're sharing the links to those in the chat box, and then finally finishing off on Friday with a session around civic space and meaningful participation. Apologies to those of you who have good hearing who can hear my washing machine beeping in the background. That's been one of the soundtracks to my lockdown and my experience of the pandemic. So I didn't really want to say much more than that. We have a range of great speakers who've agreed to come and share their thoughts and their experiences with you. And I can't think of kicking off with anybody better than Gerard Quinn. Gerard, welcome, and thank you so much for giving your time to us today. So for those of you who aren't aware, Gerard was appointed UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities in October 2020, taking over the I would say large shoes. I hope that's not insulting to Catalina, but the shoes of Catalina de Vandas. Alongside Gerard's academic career, he's also served as a member of Ireland's Commission on the Status of People with Disabilities and 2 terms on Ireland's Human Rights Commission. Gerard was also the lead focal point for the global network of national human rights institutions during much of the negotiation of the CRPD, which we know well. Gerard's agreed to share some thoughts and reflections on his first year as Special Rapporteur, with a particular focus on the impact and reaction to the COVID pandemic. So Gerard's going to speak for 15 or 20 minutes, and then there'll be a space for a Q&A, and then we'll move on to the other speakers. So if you have questions that come up during Gerard's presentation, please do add them into the chat box so that we can get to as many as possible after that. So I will take great pleasure in handing over to Gerard. Gerard, the floor is yours.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Meta. I'm really deeply honored to be with you here today. I'd like to use the time to just share some reflections on where we're at today, how we might face the future, and especially the immediate future with its many challenges. To do so, I'd like to do just 3 things. First of all, I want to add some personal reflections on the paradigm shift, or the paradigm shifts, if you will, of the UNCRPD and the UNDGs. There's very deep chemistry at play here that's not really reducible to a few slogans, and I want to try and unpack that a little bit. Secondly, I'll reflect on some of the main challenges. You all know them very well. They're amply reflected in your program, so I will be brief. And thirdly, let me reflect on the crossroads we are at now. Paradoxically, at exactly the time where the need is greatest, development assistance programs seem to be in retreat, giving rise to obvious questions like, how can we consolidate our gains? And what ought to be our priorities going forward into the future? But first, a word or two on paradigms. Take the CRPD. I've often said there are actually 2 paradigm shifts in the CRPD. The first has to do with substance, and the second has to do with process. First, substance. At the outset, I think we were all very naive in entering into the negotiations for the treaty. We thought the treaty would be another equal opportunity tract, except this time adopted at the international level. We all know by now that civil society pushed the drafters to go further. Why deal with the symptoms of exclusion and not the root cause? And that's why personhood, voice, choice, and control was ultimately deemed fundamental to the treaty. And the social conception of the person in the convention further, you might say the drafters of the treaty were more faithful to the original ideas of the Universal Declaration than any of the other human rights treaties. Why? Because economic and social rights were carefully commingled with civil and political rights. What's the point of having a right to go to school if the teachers are not trained to be sensitive to the learning needs of children with disabilities, or if the school building is itself inaccessible, or if there's no accessible transport available. So personhood, inclusion, and the careful tailoring of economic and social supports are crucial innovations in the CRPD. But there was another paradigm shift, and it has to do with process. And sometimes I think this is even more important than the substantive innovations. What's the point of correcting bad laws or even enacting new good laws if the process is itself flawed and is therefore liable to reproduce bad laws into the future? This is why collective voice and essentially the right to co-produce policy into the future is so important. At one level, the CRPD does not have all of the answers, but it imagines a process whereby we work it out for ourselves in a constructive relationship between power, government, voice, civil society, and ideas, which are blueprints for change. It's this paradigm shift, the process-based paradigm shift, that allows for a new politics of disability. It plays to the democratic responsiveness of systems and indeed helps in ratcheting open the democratic responsiveness of systems. So to me, the CRPD is a very delicate dance between substantive innovation, especially its emphasis on personhood and inclusion, and process-based innovation, especially its emphasis on co-production as the way forward. This is mirrored and indeed further entrenched in the UN SDGs. Many people insist the UN SDGs are limited by, are bounded by human rights. I see it a bit more broadly. I see the SDGs as adding to or refreshing human rights. Why? Well, in the past, much of our rights thinking was sequential. First comes economic development, then comes social change, then comes the progressive enjoyment of human rights, especially where those require social investment. So there was a temptation to see rights as a result of development rather than as a precondition for development. And I think this has been stood on its head by the deep logic of the SDGs.
All right,
The deep logic now sees economic development, social change, environmental protection, and human rights as a circular ecosystem and not a sequence. And that's crucial. Implicit to me, the process innovations are also in the SDG. Voice is critically important in securing equality for all. Why do I say all of this? Well, in the past, there might have been a temptation to think of development assistance in the disability field as a simple transfer of material assets to meet unmet needs. Itself a very patronizing narrative. Now, in as much as it involves material exchange, our imperative is not to spend it or disperse it in ways that reinforce exclusion, and at a minimum, our investments should do no harm. Optimally, they should nudge positive developments, for example, in inclusive education, especially where no systems exist or where they find it hard to set their moorings in the medical model. Equally important, our investments should seed the process of change by acknowledging ownership of change by local forces and by finding ways to animate the golden triangle between government, voice, and civil society and ideas for change. To me, this twin track approach, inclusive investments in discretes, as well as nurturing the capacity of society to face and respond to its own challenges, is powerfully reinforced by viewing the CRPD alongside the SDGs, and it underpins development assistance. What about the challenges? Let me say at the outset, and Dom has already alluded to this, our biggest challenge has to do with the sustainability and the strength of the paradigm shift or the various paradigm shifts. What do I mean by this? Well, moments of crisis reveal deep truths. And the deep truth is that the various paradigm shifts in the UN CRPD and the UN SDGs have not sunk deep enough roots. Or to put this another way, the old model hasn't disappeared, and it rears its ugly head during periods of crisis. Maybe that's to be expected. Old paradigms don't just die. They linger on in the half-life of policy and are deeply encoded in systems we have inherited. How else can we explain the massive displacement of services, even very modest services, during COVID-19? You all know the impacts were astonishing, including starvation, isolation, lack of medication. Under-inclusive preventive strategies meant that groups in vulnerable situations were not reached. Women and girls with disabilities were exposed to more violence. Persons with disabilities placed in institutions that should not exist, were at heightened risk. Their isolation was compounded by no visitation rules that actually affected monitoring bodies alongside families. Unequal treatment when it came to medical assistance was rampant. So when it mattered most systems reverted to type, and the medical model and not the human rights model came to the fore. It seems human rights was a luxury to be added back in once the crisis was over, and not a reflex deeply ingrained into the system. This is a very uncomfortable truth. It gives rise to profound questions. How can we sink the pillars of the CRPD and the SDG deeper into our various systems? I am sure part of the answer has to do with persuading systems that a proper consideration of the rights of people with disabilities helps not only in legitimizing actions, but also assists in the efficiency of those actions. After all, if there had been proper co-production of initial policy responses to COVID-19, then many of the mistakes might not have been made. So COVID-19 to me not only reveals deep systemic inequality, we all knew existed, it also reveals the gap between the law on the books, the treaty out there in the ether sphere, and the law in action on the ground. The paradigm shift or the paradigm shifts in the CRPD is a work in progress, not a done deal. A word or two about the main challenges. If systems have a tendency to revert to type during emergencies, then what might we expect during the next phase of COVID recovery efforts? An enormous amount of money turns on this, even within the European Union itself. Put it bluntly, there may be a temptation to invest in existing systems that tend to have an exclusionary impact on persons with disabilities. It's a quick fix, and systems can claim they're investing in disability. Those acting within those systems usually experience no cognitive dissonance. Professing support for human rights on the one hand is kept at arm's length from how spending programs are actually put together on the other hand. Instead, a goal to use recovery funds to reverse processes of exclusion and build a more inclusive society could well be missed. Follow the money, make sure it does no harm or compounds existing harm, and try to steer it toward more inclusion. What of digitalization? Just let me say one or two words here. The digital divide is disconcerting. I've often written about the positive value of good public procurement law, something included in the UN Disability Inclusion Strategy. But this isn't just a question of access. Virtual environments do not suit everybody. Furthermore, and this exercises me greatly, while we can purge ourselves as humans from ableism or ageism, we find that machines just love ableism and ageism. Machine learning and machine decision-making is now rampant and so interwoven in our lives, we don't even notice it anymore. Finding ways of harnessing new artificial intelligence technology will be one of our biggest challenges over the next few years, and now is a very crucial time in this endeavor. AI promises to fundamentally reset the terms of our existence as humans. If those systems revert to type, if they're allowed to revert to type, then we will have signally failed to build more inclusive societies with the aid of technology. This just cannot be allowed to happen. Speaking of phenomena that will fundamentally reset how we live, climate change is certainly well up there. And it will not impact everybody equally. It will impact most directly those who have benefited least from carbon-based economic development in the past. It will hit Indigenous communities hard. Plans to mitigate its effects will need to be co-produced with the communities affected, includes persons with disabilities. I might add that intentional efforts to build a non-carbon-based economy will have to include a consideration of the future of work to make it more inclusive of persons with disabilities. This can be done, but it is best done from the outset so that the new jobs for workers with disabilities, but a core feature of a more inclusive, non-carbon-based economy, that the process-based innovations of the CRPD and indeed the SDGs are key. The CRPD assumes a certain degree of an open democratic space. Indeed, working on disability rights helps to nudge that space even more open when it is tiny. Doing disability rights has a democratizing dividend. Yet what happens when that space is closing down? The fact of the matter is that the CRPD envisages a process of co-production. This is simply not possible without maintaining the critical autonomy of DPOs, without developing a capacity to engage, and without a system that is open to engagement. Even where the ecosystem is benign toward persons with disabilities and affects other groups more, then the closure of this civic space is still our concern. At a minimum, disability groups, in my view, have to ally with others in keeping civic systems open and responsive. The crossroads then. What a really interesting and potentially devastating set of inflection points we are at. Huge gains have been made that need to be consolidated. The World Bank's embrace of a disability agenda across all its projects by 2025 is a landmark event to be celebrated. Yet we all know that COVID-19 brutally exposed deep-seated inequalities everywhere. Systems reverted to type, and the recovery period could well set us back if systems continue to revert to type and if investments are made that simply reinforce dynamics of exclusion. Even without COVID-19, our economies and our social systems are in flux and are being remade. It is as if the terms of coexistence for this century are being set now. The disability debate is in truth part of a much larger debate. Our voices need to be heard in those debates, and still we need to keep our own distinctive voices and not allow them to be drowned out. Some of the big rights-based agendas of the CRPD have been painfully slow to materialize, including deinstitutionalization and ending segregation. One would have thought this is where development systems could have made a huge impact in nudging systems change. Development assistance also seems in general to be changing. The appetite to give seems curtailed now, since systems are keenly aware of their own need to change. However, and we have to continually reinforce this, human rights know no borders. This is especially true of disability, where the vast majority of persons with disabilities live in the developing South. Disability development assistance, changing though it is, must keep focused on nudging forward inclusionary dynamics, as well as fostering the capacity of systems to resolve matters for themselves. DPOs too are changing. It's not enough to articulate grievance. important though that still is. What's important is to develop real capacities, you might say policy entrepreneurship capacities, to co-produce change where it matters at home and locally. Here as elsewhere, development assistance, I think, is key to enabling voice, choice, and control. May I pay tribute in passing to the work of the former UN Special Rapporteur, Kata Devandas, on a report on inclusive development assistance. In my work, especially on armed conflicts, humanitarian actions, climate change, artificial intelligence, and the transformation needed in service paradigms around the world, I actively invite and greatly look forward to your input, because at the end of the day, human rights know no borders. Thank you so much.
Meta, if you're speaking, you're on mute. Oh, you can't unmute. I've just seen your note. Okay. So let me take over then. So thank you so much, Sherrod. It's difficult to respond to all of that at once, but I guess while we're waiting for some questions to come in through the chat box, because I'm sure there'll be people reflecting on everything you've said, I think one of the things that you spoke about that I think is really critical is around the Sustainable Development Goals, because I think they've created a real challenge and an opportunity, both to the movement and to allies, which is where many of the IDDC membership comes from. I think if I can be a little bit simplistic and perhaps a little bit provocative, I think building on some of what you've said, I think the CRPD has been a real comfort zone for the movement. And I think the Millennium Development Goals were a real comfort zone for NGOs and allies of the movement. And I think what the Sustainable Development Goals have done is provide an opportunity and a challenge to bring both of those together and to really think about that, as you talked about so eloquently, the dynamic between the human rights agenda and the development agenda, in much the same way as it's created that challenge between the development movement and the sustainability and environmental movement. I think it's done both of those. So it gives us that opportunity. I think some of the responses have been really interesting to me. So one example is the International Disability Alliance, IDA, and IDDC's Bridge CRPD SDGs program, which really tries to look at that and build the capacity and the capability of both the movement and its allies to respond to that agenda. But also for me, what I've seen increasingly happen, which is really interesting, is the development of properly cooperative programs. So the bread and butter, if you like, of the NGO world, development interventions programs and so on, actually looking at those with DPOs at the heart or OPDs at the heart of that process, as opposed to being brought in partway through or being brought in to give opinions or ideas and so on. I'm not saying that's working yet, it isn't, but it's definitely going in the right direction, which I think is going to be really interesting to learn from. And I hope we'll start to produce things that we can start to talk to government and other actors around as well. I think what COVID maybe does is to challenge us to do this faster as well as better, and in a sense, and I don't mean this in a light-hearted way, in a sense, COVID is giving us an opportunity to do that and learn from that before climate change hits in the way that we know that it will, which isn't to say it isn't already, but we expect that it will increase from there. So Meta, how is your mute button doing now?
Yeah, it's fine. Thank you. Yeah, it's better. So thank you for that comment, Dom, and thank you for your presentation, Gerard. I have at least one question from the chat box that I'll read out loud. And then others, please feel free to either raise your hand or post the question in the chat box. So the question coming in from Alison Marshall is, what would you recommend organizations like ours, the ones from the IDDC network, to prioritize in terms of addressing this issue with artificial intelligence? So yeah, let's take that first question. Do you have a response? What would your recommendations be? Now your mute is yeah. We need to, us who has the control, unmute you, because Gerard doesn't have the opportunity to do that himself. Okay, you're not unmuted anymore.
There I go. Thank you very much. Yeah, two great comments. I mean, I think the circular nature of economic development, social development, environmental change, and human rights in the UN SDGs is strikingly at odds with some of the traditional narratives of development and human rights. And we still haven't worked out the entailments of the move toward that more circular spatial image, if you like, but I think that's where a lot of potential lies. On the artificial intelligence one, you know, this is really important. This is being inserted into mobile devices and people in the developing South, and this is going to impact their access to credit. This is going to impact their access to jobs without them even knowing. So there's some processes already begun to kind of think through this. Our very second thematic work project is going to be on artificial intelligence and disability. And I think the development dimensions to it are critically important. I would say what would be useful is to just begin thinking about it, gathering the information, and maybe contributing or inputting into the processes we're about to open up on that particular issue. For those of you who live in Europe, there's already a draft EU regulation on artificial intelligence, which disability groups are beginning to track quite closely. That, of course, has some extraterritorial footprints, and that's quite important from a development point of view to look at. So it's an emerging field. I think one of the interesting things about disability is we shouldn't just be reacting to what's happening now. We should be looking around the corner, and there's some big changes coming in our economies and societies that we need to be very aware of, I think.
Great, thank you, Gerard. And then I have another question, something that I'm Andy Ware, who was struck by your point on the challenge for OPDs to be policy entrepreneurs. And representing an OPD myself, and I know that all of us are working with OPDs in the South in various ways. Could you please elaborate what you mean by that, and how we in the partnerships that we have best can support that, building that?
Yeah, I think a bunch of people have written about the new politics of disability created by the UN CRPD. I mean, when we were drafting it, there was lots of debates about, should we have a treaty monitoring body? Should there be a reporting procedure? And governments were saying, no, that's a failed system. You've got to come up with something new. Well, actually, at the end of the day, they reverted to a very traditional form of reporting, but they added something quite different, which is Article 33, which basically sends a very powerful message. You own the convention. The convention isn't out there in the UN sphere. It's at home in Botswana or in Kenya or in Ireland and so forth. So you have got to get that golden triangle between government, which has existed in splendid isolation for decades on disability issues, voice in civil society, the lived experience of people, and then ideas for change. And it's that mix that really is the engine room of change. If you can get that working well, then systems can be relied on to more or less achieve the right result, at least for themselves. But that depends really on civil society not just really important, but actually co-producing change. And that means developing a capacity to produce blueprints for change, to almost make the calculations for government before government makes them for themselves. As Judy Heumann, one of my favorite beings, is often fond of saying, you've got to know more when you go into the minister's office than the minister themselves know, and then produce, or rather paint a different kind of high ground and nudge change forward like that. And this calls for a lot of skills. It's not just knowledge about what you're doing violates X, Y, or Z of a treaty. It's actually the capacity to put forward very positive blueprints for change. And many of our civil society groups are first class at doing that. And what I've always dreamt about is ways of transferring that know-how, not the knowledge, but the know-how to interact successfully with government. That's critically important to change. So that's what I meant by policy entrepreneurship. And that's what I mean by the new politics.
Really interesting. Thank you so much. I'm sure we could have a full session where you elaborated on that. I'll take one final question from Hannah. A pretty broad question, but also the final one for this round. She's saying that you spoke briefly about the issue that during COVID-19 crisis, there was a tendency to revert to type. And she thinks that we saw this even where progress has been made. So here comes the question. What do you think needs to be done to ensure that this isn't the default during crisis? So if you could try to respond to that question, and then we'll end this part of the session.
You know, we're going to have many more crises in the future. Who knows what they're going to be? But certainly the voice of people with disabilities is not there at the beginning when all of our systems began to respond to those crises. It's as if the procedure, the process-based innovations of the convention simply were ignored. And I think one powerful argument for a reset into the future, for making sure crisis responses into the future do in fact take into account the situation of people with disabilities, is to make sure that systems understand that this isn't just a nice thing to do. It isn't just for increasing the legitimacy of the responses. It actually goes to the efficiency of those responses. So lots and lots and lots of mistakes that actually cost lives as well as money could have been avoided if we had gotten that co-production process right from the very beginning. So I think the big lesson is in the future, in terms of crisis responses, how do we embed the voice of people with disabilities in from the get-go and not as a luxury to be folded back?
Well, thank you so much, Gerard, for joining our session, and congratulations with your first year as special rapporteurs. Definitely a very different year than probably expected, but it was really valuable that you joined us here today to share some of your insights, and there are lots of more questions that we'd like to discuss with you, but hopefully there'll be other opportunities for that. So thank you so much, and I'll give the word over to Dom, who will take us through the next part of the session.
Thanks very much, Meta, and thanks again, Gerard. And do feel free to stay for the rest of the session, but we know you're busy as well. So if you need to disappear, that's you do so with our blessing. Thank you. Okay, so very little from me. I'm delighted to introduce three speakers on our panelist, three panelists rather, who are going to talk to us a bit, and then hopefully there'll be time for a little bit of dialogue with each as we go, and a little bit of time at the end as well. So it gives me massive pleasure to hand over to Bhargavi Devar. Bhargavi, who I feel like we've met each other at least 6 times in the last week, Bhargavi, in the build up to COSP, so it's lovely to see you again. Bhargavi is a person with a psychodisability and has worked for more than 2 decades on the human rights of persons with psychosocial disabilities. She founded the Bapu Trust, the first user survivor organization in India, in 1999, and is presently director of TCI, which stands for Transforming Communities for Inclusion of Persons with Psychosocial Disabilities, which is a global DPO and focusing on Article 19. Bhargavi, that's entirely enough from me. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Dom. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
All right. Yeah. So I really resonated a lot with Dr. Quinn's idea of policy entrepreneurship. TCI focuses on inclusion, and we named ourselves Transforming Communities for Inclusion rather than anything else in our movement on human rights. Because inclusion requires a lot of proactive measures at the community level. And we need to be building communities for support systems and all of that. And so ours is a solution-based enterprise. We love to engage our members in different countries on, yeah, we know the problems, but what kind of solutions can we think about? What kind of recommendations would we make at the national level? So largely we focus on empowerment of persons with psychosocial disabilities so that they get included first within the cross disability movement, and then they are able to take their issues within different SDGs related, development related policy matters. As you know, in the mental health sector, there are many factors that lead from mild to severe discrimination and exclusion, even in times when we didn't have a pandemic. Over the years, following the CRPD and at the UN level, many of you will be aware of several kinds of guidance which have been released of the mandate to realize the right to live in communities for all persons with disabilities, including, of course, persons with social disabilities. Against the COVID context, there has been growing concern about deinstitutionalization at all levels, and Dr. Quinn spoke about it quite at length. It's not just for persons with psychosocial disabilities, and we've seen this happen with people with mental and multiple disabilities, the elderly, and children with disabilities. These people are too easily pushed into an institutional setting. During COVID times, their exclusion has magnified a lot, along with a serious threat to the right to life. Our learnings in TCI comes from extensive engagement in projects like the Sahar project of the Bapu Trust, which developed under the shadow of the CRPD and had a very specific purpose of being compliant with CRPD, which meant that we will not institutionalize people, we will create support systems, we will offer choice, we will keep the person at the center of their own lives. This is a big commitment to make. And this project is now about 10 years old. Right now, it's in a very saturated state of maturation. We're very proud of this project. It's a large population-based project, and it was a response to the challenge we received from some donors that, what you're doing is unique. It's unique to your little city and your little, low-income community where you're working. You cannot scale it. We showed that not only we can scale, the creation of community support systems, but we can also build trainings out of it. So we did 2 levels of scaling. So in this project, we learned that community programs on mental health must have the outcome of inclusion and not just treatment of mental disorders. This meant reframing the debate, what Dr. Quinn referred to as a paradigm shift from, for example, how many mental health professionals are available to how many support systems are available. Is there medication in primary care versus is personal assistance, befriending services, companionship services, safe spaces, are these available in the communities? We learned that it is possible to prepare communities, low income, that's our context. We work with the urban poor towards inclusion using a variety of strategies of negotiation, awareness building, and all of that in the community setup. For this also for inclusion to happen, as the CRPD and the SDGs together have guided, we need a whole range of generic development linked services and as well as specific psychosocial services available in the communities. For example, we do a lot of work on preparing documentation for people so they can access other services. For example, the national card, the ration card, the bus card, and a PAN card, a tax card, and so on and so forth. This is very critical for people to be able to access other kinds of services. So SAHAR experience has shown us that focus on mental health alone may well result in exclusion, whereas focusing on psychosocial well-being within an overall SDGs framework will be a more comprehensive response, bring resources and opportunities within development to persons with psychosocial disabilities. During the pandemic, for persons with mental health issues, circles of care, their peer and support systems minimized or were cut off altogether. For several, family life became more challenging as resources and capacity for care dwindled. Violence within households increased. For people who were hearing voices, were homeless or facing higher restrictions of participation, essential services became more remote. And so there were serious compromises for persons with psychosocial disabilities on receiving accessible information about corona, because a household had one phone, often held by the man of the house. So, and people did not have access to phones, and which meant that they had absolutely no social contact. And so on. There was a compromise on privacy and dignity as they were questioned a lot. So family control became that much more severe. So the need for a data plan and a self-owned phone was heard very loudly from low-income communities. And also not Android high-profile gadgets, but really simple phones which they can use just to keep social contact. And we have seen a lot of trauma relating to death of loved ones, of neighbors, the terrors of witnessing sudden death, extended periods of caregiving for the survivors, inability to have final parting rituals, the shocking disruption of life and social support, the environment of lockdowns and their own repercussions. So considering all of this, we in TCI and the Bapu Trust have some suggestions which we are also implementing in the grassroots, absent too much of investment on these from the government. And it's great that I'm presenting this in the IDDC platform so that a lot of people who are supporting community development may also take heed of the inclusion of persons with psychosocial disabilities. Deinstitutionalization. Again, Dr. Quinn brought this up several times. The process involved in this are that much more difficult with the pandemic than without. But in an ideal world where there is resources and where there is a scheme for doing this humanely within the human rights framework, this must be done. Malnourishment, poor healthcare quality of the residents of institutions does not prepare them for the pandemic world outside. Bapu Trust has been working the deinstitutionalization project. We were working on it before the pandemic and we are working on it now during the pandemic. It hasn't been easy. We already have a large population-based support network for people. So it's not community support systems that we lack. But that was not enough. Deinstitutionalized people internally feel free for the first time in years. They have got their freedom. However, they go into another kind of institutionalization through the lockdown. And then they start taking risks, exposing themselves to the pandemic. There are needs for cash transfer, compensation for the resettlement process, ample support, personal assistance, support in accessing healthcare, other than a range of development supports, particularly housing and work. This is so critical. Addressing psychosocial impact of Corona with mobilizing communities and neighborhoods as support systems. We are seeing a lot of this in our communities where people and organizations are voluntarily coming forward to catalyze community support systems at this time. This needs investments. People need the money. And so community support systems, if they have to have an outcome of inclusion, also have a cost. Digitizing the information is important, but doing that in terms of creating support communications and having skill building training sessions on simple phones and gadgets, this has a cost, and it's important to do this at this time. Finally, preparing for long-lasting trauma and addressing that through psychosocial well-being frameworks. PTSD, the post-traumatic stress disorder, has limitations as it pushes persons with disabilities back into the medical model. So while psychosocial and well-being services are important, we have to be cautious about making mental health a medical silo, which is a sure path to exclusion. Along with several dozens of trauma support, TCI and the Bapu Trust are involved in providing trainings for CBO on supporting people with common and intensive trauma experiences of insomnia, panic, flashbacks, grief and loss, anxiety, night terrors, and a variety of embodied experiences relating to the pandemic. This is going to last a long time, and so it needs preparation. It's as if there is a worldwide tsunami situation, and it's really vital, especially for children and young adults who are facing a lifelong memory of the pandemic, have some solutions which are supportive and which releases their traumas in a humane, and such solutions along with development solutions will help people feel calmer and prepare to face another day. So thank you so much for that. I think there are a number of ideas there for services to build back inclusively. Those investments cannot be emphasized.
Thank you so much, Bhargavi. Thank you. And I'm really pleased we're recording the session because, as you know, even within the disability movement, persons with psychosocial disabilities are often unheard. And you know, we know that there are particularly marginalized groups, and I hope very much that others who aren't able to tune in today will be able to listen to your thoughts and ideas. Thank you. In the interest of time, I'm going to pass hopefully directly to John Wambua from UDPK. John, are you able to unmute yourself? I know you had some connection issues.
Hello, Dom. Yeah, can you hear me?
We can hear you perfectly, John. Thank you. So let me just introduce you, John, for those who don't know you. So John is a program and communication officer from the United Disabled Persons of Kenya, known to many of us as UDPK. John has a physical disability and is championing disability inclusion through advocacy work. John, it's great to meet you. We haven't met before, but in these strange times, this is how we meet people for the first time. So John, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Dom, a lot for the invite and also for the participants. I had a few connection challenges. That's why, in fact, I'm not able to put my camera on, but I'm sure you can hear me quite well. UDPK, United Disabled Persons of Kenya, we umbrella organization in our country. We have grassroots representation in all the 47 counties in our country. So we had a fair assessment on the impact the COVID-19 has had on persons with the disabilities. And we try as much as possible to advocate for inclusion of persons with the disability as a government and local government also develop interventions. On the impact of the COVID-19 on persons with the disabilities in our country, what comes forth in mind, or what we were getting mostly through the projects we were doing, and also through some of the data collection we were doing, was the impact on the livelihoods. When the COVID-19 hit our country, most of our companies, specifically private companies, they had to downsize. They had to downsize their staff and also their operations. And this led to job losses and a lack of retention to persons with the disabilities. and without jobs and source of livelihood. So it was hard, and it's still hard for them probably to provide for themselves and their families as the other persons in the populations. And also these companies that were persons with the disability probably were giving them tenders and contracts to supply this and that. They also downsized on the outsourcing. So for persons who are employed, apart from being laid off, the persons with the disability who are also engaged in private sector as suppliers, they also saw their contracts being cancelled or also being pushed to some further date. And also this impacted them greatest. So the issue of livelihood that we saw, it had a great impact on persons with the disability. Now, Kenyan government, they tried to cushion persons with the disability with some social support services, social inclusion support services. We call them the social protection through our Ministry of Labor and Social Protection. So the government trying to cushion job losses and the severity of the economic impact to persons with the disability, they had a program where they were doing some cash transfers. They were giving some cash transfers to persons with the disability. So we as an organization, as the umbrella organization where we came in, was mostly just to make sure this distribution of this cash and also distribution of information regarding the cash transfers was accessible to persons with the disabilities. So we tried to pick the message, to pick the communication channel that the social protection was using, and then we tried to fine tune it and also to basing on mind on the issues to do with accessibility. We try to populate it and disseminate it in accessible formats to our membership throughout the country. Another impact was probably on education. When the COVID-19 hit our country, the schools were closed. Students were to study from home, and this was directly from the Ministry of Education. And then there was a shift. Now, because it was no longer feasible to do the physical, the traditional schooling, students were advised to shift on the online schooling. Online schooling now poses a great challenge to students and pupils with the disabilities simply because of accessibility issues. The content that was being taught, it was not really in a format that was accessible to students and pupils with disabilities. So it was an additional challenge to that. And also there was another issue of availability of the gadgets themselves, the smartphones, availability of internet itself. So it was a multi-faced challenges to students and people with disability. When you couple that with the hard economic time, then the students in education were impacted a lot. As an organization for persons with disability, the UDPK, and together with other partners, what we tried to do was to develop some interventions in the sense that we had some programs that we tried to develop accessible digital textbooks. We had partnered with some of the leading organizations on that. And that was one of the interventions we were trying to bring forth, because students were being taught to access these materials that were not accessible online. So we were trying to make that content accessible. And those are some of the interventions we were just trying to get involved in, and some of them are also ongoing. Due to the interest of time, probably I can just speak of health. Persons with the disability in regard to health and COVID-19 in our country, it had impacted them definitely a lot, because we had a restriction of movement and some of our sections in our society were locked down. So for persons with the disability who needed probably around the clock care from the medical professionals, or who needed some medical services like physiotherapy and others, they were no longer able to go to the doctors or move freely to their preferred medical center and get assisted. So this was some of the challenges that persons with the disabilities really faced during the pandemic. And the great one that I think I should also mention was to do with the information accessibility. The persons with the disability, initially, they weren't able really to access government directives or even the government services that were available during the pandemic, because the information that was being issued was not accessible to persons with the disability. There was also some updates that the Ministry of Education was doing, and some press releases that the Ministry of Education was doing regarding information on how people should take care of themselves, to social distancing and all that. But this information we noted was not accessible to persons with a disability. To that regard, we were working with the Ministry of Health and some other related line ministries. We were just trying to sensitize them to come up with the way of making sure whatever they were doing was inclusive to persons with the disabilities. So after some time, we started seeing Kenya Sign Language interpreters in Ministry of Health news conferences. When they were releasing this, they were slightly mindful now of the inclusion sector. So information accessibility was also a factor in the COVID-19 pandemic. Some of the positive things I could say to persons with the disability was that during the pandemic, we saw increased engagement of persons with the disability and the duty bearers. We could see at the grassroots levels, persons with disability, they were engaging their local authorities to make sure they were included in the interventions in the programs that the local authorities were developing. Both in grassroots and in national level, we could see there was some impetus in engaging the local authority and on disability issues. I think though I might want to pause it there due to the interest of time and just hand it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. Thank you. That was, really rich and lots of really good detailed specific examples, which I know people will find useful. And thank you particularly, John, for stepping in at such short notice. I know Anderson wasn't able to join us, but that was great. Thank you very much. Again, in the interest of time, I'm going to try and leave a little bit of time for responding to the various comments that are coming up in the chat box. Thank you to the participants for that. I'm going to pass over to Priscilla now. Priscilla probably needs very little introduction to most of you, having been both my immediate predecessor as chair of IDDC, but also having worked in the sector for more years than I'm sure she would want me to share with you. Priscilla's also now the driving force at IDA, really looking at what it means to be CRPD compliant in the implementation of development programming. And perhaps the interface between the SDGs and the CRPD is very much kind of her domain, if you like. I'm still not sure whether going from IDDC to IDA is gamekeeper turned poacher or poacher turned gamekeeper. I don't know. I'll leave that thought with you while I hand over to Priscilla. Priscilla, please. Thank you very much, Tom. And it's a pleasure to be addressing the IDDC General Assembly after some time. So thanks for the opportunity, and I convey an apology from Vladimir, who would have liked to be with you, but it's unfortunately not really a convenient time. So I was asked to share a few reflections on and a few words on IDA's work related to COVID-19. I think you already know a lot about it because I think it has been quite visible in the disability sphere, but also because in many cases this was done in close collaboration with IDDC, which I think is a great proof of a robust and long-lasting partnership between the two networks. But still, to share a few words about what we have done, I think our work has been mostly twofold. One has been, for many of you, specific actions responding to the situation caused by the COVID-19 global pandemic. And another was also how we were, as a DPO network, to adapt the rest of our work to this protracted crisis. So in terms of specific COVID-19 actions,
mostly what we have done is first immediately responding by setting this COVID-19 Global Task Force for Advocacy and coordinating the campaigns that were absolutely needed to react to discriminatory triage practices, to react to lack of accessibility in information, ending to promote ways of ending discrimination and pass messages or at an early stage to rebuild a world that is more inclusive. More recently, we have focused on a campaign to prioritize persons with disabilities in access to vaccination. And you might have been aware also of a call to action that we released with the GLAD network to really draw the attention of the world on the importance of not cutting the funding for persons with disabilities. Part of our work has also been to mobilize movement and to support it to continue to operate in this context of crisis. It has been a fundamental aspect of our collective response, creating space for discussions, initially with a lot of Facebook live broadcasts, and creating opportunities for DPOs to exchange peer-to-peers. We also established a COVID-19 pool fund last year, supporting OPD's responses to COVID-19 advocacy campaigns or formulating messages from underrepresented disability constituencies. And that's something that overall we keep growing the type of support to our members. Also, a third very important element of our COVID-specific response has been building the evidence. What is it that is happening? What is the impact of COVID on persons with disabilities and on OPDs? So we partnered with IDDC on the Disability Rights Monitor COVID-19, as you know. We also collected experiences from our members on adapting to the pandemic. All of this is on the website. And more recently, and I'll present you very preliminary findings, we have worked on a COVID-19 survey on how persons with disabilities are adapting to the situation, and on a qualitative study to take a slightly different lens and look at the impact of COVID-19 on OPDs, on organizations of persons with disabilities. Besides this, obviously adaptations to I just mentioned that in passing, but I think it's really interesting to connect with IDDC members on that. We are developing an online accessible survey tool, also an online accessible learning platform. We're shifting our advocacy practices to virtual coffees with diplomats. So it's just a snapshot of adaptations that I'm sure all organizations have had to do as well. So coming back to more recent findings from these two surveys that I mentioned, it's really, really preliminary, but what we wanted to try and capture, the analysis is still ongoing, is to have a stronger focus on the socioeconomic recovery, how persons with disabilities who are disproportionately impacted by the pandemic are coping with the situation, and have a stronger focus on underrepresented groups. So we've got over 500 responses from 69 countries, with almost 80% from the Global South. And what is really interesting is also a large share of populations who were previously not covered by other surveys, such as 23% of indigenous respondents or people who are from a racial minority. What we find, I mean, unfortunately corroborates things that we heard about. It provides additional evidence on the fact that support services are really an issue, and 43% of people said that support services were negatively affected by the pandemic, and the loss of this support was much higher among indigenous populations. Similarly, on income, 47% said that they lost all or some of their income during the pandemic. And again, higher impact on underrepresented groups, with up to 62% for people with intellectual disabilities. So these are just a couple of figures I can extract at this stage. As I said, the analysis is still ongoing, and I think it will provide further food for reflection on how we reprioritize the building of the next phase if we want to build back more inclusively. One final thing that I wanted to say, share with you as well, and I will echo also a very important message that Jared Quinn passed in the opening of this session, is the importance, if we really want to shift paradigm and to co-produce the world of tomorrow by having inclusive policies, is to embark and invest and work with organizations of persons with disabilities. And unsurprisingly, they have been also very affected by the pandemic. The preliminary finding from this qualitative study that we are conducting with Social Development Direct and the Disability Inclusive Development Consortium actually show that because people are impacted, their organizations are impacted. So in Nigeria, for example, people with albinism have stopped having access to health-related care, and a lot of the members of some DPOs have actually died of non-COVID related health issues. So that's an example of how organizations are impacted. Many of the challenges have already been named related to communication. The shift to online work remains a big challenge. Change of priorities is also something that has been really severely impacting the disability rights movements. Some DPOs reporting we had to make food packets because our members were starving. I think this really jeopardizes potentially in the future that co-production of an inclusive future. If advocacy is stopped because OPDs cannot operate, then how can they be these policy entrepreneurs co-producing tomorrow's world? So I think this is, as a conclusion, one point that I would like to keep from Jared's message, and that as IDA, I really want to stress with IDDC, that if we are going to engage in this new phase of building back better, the paradigm shift should be really at the center. And that means investing in OPD's capacity to engage, and also ensuring that as a lot of things across IDA, IDDC, and our members, we can do this through inclusive programming, really practicing this shift and showing that despite the budget cuts, we can achieve strategic, we are cohesive, and we can advocate with the disability rights movement empowered to do so. So I will close here and hand over back to you, Dom. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Priscilla. So we have gone from India to Kenya to Lyon. So thank you so much to Bagavi, John, and Priscilla. It's now time for just a few questions for you who have been speaking. But before I come with that question, I have a question to all participants. It's actually raised by Johanna, who is asking for positive examples where OPDs have been involved in recovery plans. So rather than to ask this question to the panelists, I'd like to invite some of the 80 participants in this workshop to maybe join the chat box if you have any positive examples. So back to you, panelists, and thank you so much, all three of you, for great presentations, really insightful. There's been quite some comments in the chat about culture issues, taboos, hidden children, and so on, and also with great interaction from various participants, amongst others, Connie. But Bagavi, maybe I'll start by sending, how do you see that we can address cultural issues and taboos and so on relating to persons with disabilities. I don't know if you've been following the chat, but
well, in our program, in Pune city, we are very culturally, we first inform ourselves what are the perceptions. We do a lot of baseline studies. We try to capture the way in which people express their idioms of distress. In psychosocial disability, therefore, we are concerned about the way people describe their emotional experiences, their experiences of exclusion, all of that. So we do extensive baseline to understand that. So we know that we are not pushing on something which is culturally acceptable to them. I think to respect culture and to use culture as a resource, that has been our main strategy. When we hit roadblocks on inclusion of persons with disabilities in general, then we do extensive awareness programs. So there are, especially about fate, about karma, there are a lot of views about that, and those allow families to be neglectful of the person with a disability. So we do address issues by mobilizing communities, the neighbors especially. We mobilize neighbors where we see much exclusion, we mobilize the neighbors and we push the moral button of those communities. And consider that we work in low-income communities. Therefore, these techniques are possible for us. Sometimes we may bring a culturally acceptable figure like the imam, the religious head of the community, to speak to the family. So in this way, we do address some of those issues.
great. Thank you so much. And then maybe this one is also, maybe it could be directed to you, Priscilla, also following our discussion about partnerships with OPDs in the South. It's from Lauren from Able Child Africa, who's asking, how do we as a movement see the investment into OPDs coming from? And where should we be advocating for it to come in the short term? Because we're seeing cuts in ODA from the UK government and potentially others. So following your comments, Priscilla, also on how COVID-19 has affected OPDs, would you like to comment on this question?
Sure. Thank you, Lauren, for the question. Yes, indeed. At times of budget cuts, it's challenging for everyone. But I think if there's something that needs to be maintained, is really the ethos of the CRPD. And one of the things that the CRPD legally anchored by creating an obligation through Article 4.3 is to consult and actively involve persons with disabilities through their representative organizations. And we see that when the voices of persons with disabilities were not there, the policies, the responses, the programs are not inclusive. So I think in terms of prioritizing investments, keeping those voices at the center and prioritizing the human resources that enable that voice to be at the table is something really important. We had testimonies from OPDs saying, well, for 3 months, we could not implement our activities. And then as a result of that, our donors could not maintain the salaries. So now we have no staff to do anything. And I think if we don't realize the power of that voice, there's no way that we're going to build back inclusively, because again, it will be overlooked. And again, we will revert to type and the old models and what people know of. So investing in people, investing in developing the capacities, investing in also, that's an interesting message that came from the qualitative studies with focus groups from Zimbabwe, Nigeria, and Bangladesh in cohesive approach. So not one DPO here, one DPO there, but approaches that foster collaboration across different groups. I think TCI has provided a very great model for that, valuing the contribution of underrepresented groups within the broader movement, building those connections, and also across levels, so from community to national, and connecting with global and regional members of IDA for another type of advocacy. But I think as we shift to addressing new challenges that require to be centered on the person, to be centered on local solutions, they need to be invented at the local level by local communities. And we need to connect the dots and share experiences. And that can only be done if we are strategic and if we think bigger picture rather than going to the likely partners and reproducing also through our partnerships, the type of interactions that have been dominant for years.
Yeah, thank you very much, Priscilla. John, there's also a question for you. We know that you have made a statement on COVID vaccinations to the Kenyan government from your organization, from UDPKCRA. So have you had any response from the Kenyan government on this statement? And maybe elaborate for those of us who are not into the details what your statement was on. I mean, yeah. Are you still with us, John?
Hi, Mette, it's Angelique. I think John had a connection issue because I don't see him connected.
That will be a cliffhanger then. Then I'll give the final, the possibility of the final question for Akhil Paul, who has hand up. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. For most of the presentations, I was there, but in between, because of the weather, we had to disconnect. But it's not a question. I mean, I had an organization in India. We work with deafblind people, and I know my previous speaker was talking about problem of resources, and the governments are changing policies in a way that it is going to affect NGOs, and more so they are going to push us towards corporate and other places. So I think we, as NGO fraternity, as the non-government organization, not-for-profit organization, as a fraternity, we need to do active advocacy with funding foundations, create IDDC can take a lead and create a foundation, a pool of resource, which can support organizations who are struggling in these kind of situations. Because in every country, the government is going insensitive day by day. Thank you.
Thank you for that comment. There was also comments on the partnerships with OPDs and capacity building, and I'd like to refer your attention also to the workshop we have Friday on the thematic session for civic space and meaningful participation. That could also be an opportunity to continue some of these discussions. And I've seen a lot of great comments and also a few examples of engagement in the recovery phase, both from DPOD, and then there was a final one also. Now I can't see, but please, there was an example from Sim Brown. So please also follow see the comments in the chat box. So we've actually reached the point of this session where it's time to close off, unfortunately. On behalf of IDDC, I would really like to thank all the speakers and the participants for your participation and for your enlightening presentation, comments, and interactions. I think this is really a great opening session of this IDDC week of the annual meeting. Also, a huge thanks to the interpreters and the captioning. And then we would like to share with you some of the upcoming global events, to show also where there are upcoming possibilities of interaction and influencing, and maybe putting forward some of the comments and reflections from this workshop. So there is the Conference of State Parties to the CRPD coming up in the middle of June, a virtual event making it easier for broad participation. There's the high-level political forum in July on the Sustainable Development Goals. And then there's the Global Disability Summit in February 2022, which will also be an online event, but somehow taking place in Norway. There will be more on this to come. So this was just to lead your attention to some of the key events coming up. Then I'd just like to finish off by saying that I really hope that you have enjoyed this first introductory workshop session that has tried to broadly set the scene on disability inclusion, current challenges, and how we can build back inclusively. And I also hope you'll have a chance to join some of the upcoming works. There's one later this afternoon or later today, whichever time zone you are in. And then there's also workshops tomorrow, Wednesday, and there's one Friday. Thank you all for your participation. Thank you.